Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory will the toils of life repay. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all...
6 to begin with of John chapter 17. This, of course, is that chapter that records the prayer of Jesus that was offered shortly before his arrest and crucifixion. And it's in the middle of that prayer. And Jesus says these words, "I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of the world. Yours they were, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word." This is about the 12. The 12 disciples who would be called apostles. And the text is very clear here as Jesus offers this prayer. He says, yours they were. These are not strangers and aliens. These were not people that were not familiar with God, that were not familiar with the scriptures, that were not familiar with the law of the prophets. They were familiar. They belonged to God. They were associated with God. Yours they were. You gave them to me. So they were given by the Father to the Son. We are familiar with the apostles. If you grew up in Bible classes as a child, you memorized the names of the apostles. I will not embarrass you, but my guess is if I ask you to name the apostles, there are 3 or 4 or 5 names that we would be able to remember, and the balance of the 12, not so much. That's because there's not a whole lot said about some of these men past the handful of lists of their names in the New Testament. However, we know some things about them. We know what Jesus said here about them. Yours they were. They have kept your word. We know the work that they did. We know the sacrifice that they made. That these are the men who preached the gospel and who dealt with the persecution that arose against the gospel. And they were abused and they suffered and ultimately they died for their faith and for the preaching of the gospel. One exception to that is John, who lived to be an old man. Of course, even he, though he wasn't executed, was exiled and finished his life removed from the world that he knew and had participated in. They did not have easy lives. We recognize that these were good, godly men. This lesson, though, is an examination of the scriptures about who these men were and what we do know about them. And sometimes our romantic envisioning of the lives of these men, very different thing than what the Bible presents them as, which is totally and completely human, just like you and I. And why I want to talk about this, because there are a lot of people who seem to think that there are these godly people who are here, and then there's me. And I just can't seem to overcome the challenges that I face and the stumbling that I do. And I'm just not good enough for God. And I chose the verse that I chose very specifically because it says, yours they were, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. I want you to remember those three things. They belonged to God before they were disciples of Jesus. They were the 12 disciples of Jesus that would be called apostles. And they did keep his word. I want you to remember that through all of the things that we talk about tonight. These people, we learn, are chosen. They are picked. Some folks like to say it this way: they were handpicked. Handpicked by God, chosen by Christ, is the way it's made clear to us in Luke. In Luke chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, it says this: in these days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And so here's Jesus, who leaves the community where he was staying. He goes out into a deserted area up on the mountain where he's by himself, and he spends all night in prayer. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Now, we don't know exactly how many followers he had at this point, how many students, how many disciples that he had, but it was clearly more than 12. And he spends a night in prayer to God, and then he goes back and he calls all of his disciples to himself. And from all of his disciples, Luke says that he chose 12 of them that he would name apostles. These men are called, as we continue the story, exactly where they stand. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, Matthew is sitting in a tax booth when Jesus says, come follow me. In Luke 6 and verse 15, Simon is identified as a zealot. So he is an individual that's identified from the outset as an extremist. That's what the word zealot means. Peter, Andrew, James, and John are fishermen. Uneducated, untrained fishermen. And there is nothing in the record about any refinement of them prior to his choosing them. They didn't start off in those places and then go sign up at the local university and take classes and get a degree and get kind of polished up and trained and fit and ready. And then Jesus says, oh, yeah, you'll do. That's not what happened. They're not corrected and then summoned. They don't get a letter 6 months in advance saying, hey, I'm kind of looking at you and I might be able to use you in service to me, but there's a couple of things that you need to change. And if you can affect these changes, then you can come and go with me. That is not what happens. They don't go through an internship. He doesn't go to Matthew. Matthew said to the tax collector, I'm a little concerned about this tax thing that you're doing. And so I would have you to come follow me and spend 3 months with me. And this will be a trial period. And if it works out, then I'll let you stay. But if you don't develop enough in this internship, then I'll turn you loose. That is not what happens either. They're called and they go. Knowing what they know with the character traits and the personality traits and all the other interesting things that make them individuals that they had, with all of their varied backgrounds, they go. The next thing I want you to notice about the biblical record of these men is their nearness to Jesus did not equal understanding nor morality. You kind of think, or at least I do, maybe I shouldn't impose that upon other people, that here they were and they were with Jesus day after day after day after day, and they had better understanding than anybody else, and they were special, and their character was kind of special. They were the 12. And you might even want to say there were three of the 12 that made an even smaller and closer group to Jesus. And we're going to talk about one of those three too in the next few moments. As we see that nearness to Jesus did not mean that they understood, and it did not mean that they were necessarily moral, self controlled people. They're brought close enough by Jesus to see things that other people did not see and to hear things that other people did not hear. They witnessed all of the signs that he worked. Not everyone got to witness everything that he did. They heard all of the teaching. Not everyone got to hear all the teaching. I can surmise that there are probably people that heard him speak one time, and that's all they ever heard him. That's all the teaching they got. And maybe it was one of the short parables. And that's what they heard. And that's the only thing they heard. But these people, they got to hear it all. And they didn't just get to hear his public teaching, they also got to hear the things that he said privately to them after the public teaching. Sometimes giving them insight that the rest of the audience didn't receive, as he explained even more fully what he was talking about. A few of them even occasionally got to see some very unique insights into Jesus, spend some very, very personal time with Jesus. When Jesus is in the garden, weeping and praying before he's arrested, there were three of them there. At the transfiguration, there were three of them there. They saw things and experienced. I can't imagine what it would have been like to witness the transfiguration. But three of them got to. That's how close they were. But despite all of that intimacy, despite all of that time, all of that teaching, all of those experiences, this is what the Bible says about them at various times. Mark 6 in verse 52. For they did not understand about the loaves. They had just witnessed. They had just witnessed a miracle. They had just heard a bunch of teaching connected to that miracle. They did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. That's important language. Not only did they not understand, they were refusing to listen. Their hearts were hardened. They wouldn't receive the message. You remember that parable that Jesus taught about the sower? The sower went out to sow a seed. He cast the seed. Some of the seed fell on the wayside. That's what he's doing. These people were the wayside at this point. This is the 12 who belonged to God, who were now his, who were with him all the time, who were seeing everything and hearing everything and were as close to him as any people on the earth could possibly be. And they didn't understand because their hearts were hardened. Chapter 9, verses 31 and 32. He was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. So there's two things that we hear here. Again, they don't understand. They don't understand it. Just because they were there and they heard it all did not mean that they automatically understood it all. So here again, they don't understand. But beyond that, we get another peek into them. They don't ask. There are two people in this room that I'm absolutely certain are keenly aware of what I'm fixing to say. Really, four people. All of us should be, but some of us have to remember back a lot longer than the others. What's the characteristic of a toddler, an average toddler, between the ages of 2 and 6? How many questions a day do they ask you? About 1,000,000. About everything. If they don't understand something, they ask. Why? How? All sorts of questions like they know those words well. If they don't understand something, they ask. They're not afraid to ask. They want to know. You know when we start getting afraid to ask things? When we're afraid of the answer. And that's what it says here about these people. They didn't understand, but they were afraid to ask him. They didn't want to understand. They weren't willing to walk up and say, hey, I don't really understand what you're saying here. Can you explain this to me in a way that I'll grasp what you're saying? I really want to know and understand what you're teaching me. But they didn't do that. They were afraid to ask. In Luke 18, in verse 34, but they understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what was said. And in this passage, it's such a big deal. It is essentially repeated 3 times. They understood none. It was hidden. They did not grasp. Those are parallel ideas. And any time that you say something 3 times in 3 different ways about the same people in the same circumstances, you are trying to highlight the situation. And that's exactly what's going on here in Luke 18. They did not understand a thing about what he was saying. This is the disciples, these 12 special people who belong to the Father, who were given to him out of the world by the Father, the ones that he looked over all his disciples after spending a night in prayer, looked over all his disciples and said, these are the 12. These are the ones. I'm going to make these my apostles. They understood none of these things. It was hidden from them. They did not grasp it. Listen, if this is an internship, they're getting their pink slip soon. They're not catching on. But that's not the way God dealt with them. That's not the way God makes decisions. He doesn't see as man sees. He looks at something else. In the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verses 8 and 9, we got one identified, Philip, one of the 12. He's had this extended time with Jesus at this point. And he says, Lord, show us the Father. And Jesus, well, I can imagine him just shaking his head as he says, have I been with you so long and you still don't know me, Philip? And then there's Judas, the special case. John 12:6 simply tells us he was a thief. He was right there with Jesus all the time. He heard all the teaching. He saw all the miracles. He walked with him. Jesus gave him the money bag and entrusted him to take care of their treasure. He was a thief. He didn't become a moral guy just because he was in the inner circle, just because he was close to Jesus, just because he heard all the teaching. Matthew 26, verses 14 and 15 says this. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" I want you to think about that for just a moment. This did not start. The idea of betraying Jesus did not start with the enemies of Jesus. Not according to Matthew. They hated Jesus. They were trying to figure out a way to do away with Jesus. They were looking for an opportunity, but it was Judas who had the idea and went to them and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. I don't know what a piece of silver was worth back then. I don't know how it compares to a modern American dollar. I would like to think that my life is worth more than 30 pieces of silver. I would like to think that my friends who spent day after day with me would think that my life was worth more than 30 pieces of silver. That you couldn't pay somebody. I'll be generous. I don't think this is a fair comparison, but I'll do it anyway. That you couldn't pay somebody $50 to get them to hand me over so I could be killed. But Judas, who was one of the 12, was a thief. And he looked at his association and his intimacy with Jesus as an opportunity to gain something for himself. He wasn't listening to Jesus. He wasn't learning from Jesus like he ought to have been. He was using Jesus to put 30 pieces of silver in his pocket. What can I get from you to deliver him to you? That's one of the 12. There's exposure to Jesus that they have. They're exposed to his works. They're exposed to his teaching, but they don't have full perception, and they don't even have improved character. Not all of them. And let's just lay all things bare about them. That's what happens as they continue with Jesus. Problems surface from time to time about these individuals, and things have to be addressed. Mark chapter 10 and verse 37. James and John are jockeying for position among the group. Grant us to sit at your right hand. This worldly idea of position and place and honor, and I want to be one at your right hand. I want to be the most important people of the group. I've already been selected out of the disciples, and the disciples have already been selected out of the world. And so we got the world here. We got this small group of disciples of Jesus, and from among them, there's these 12 people that are special to Jesus and with him all the time. I'm already part of that group, but that's not good enough. I want to be at the top of that group. I want to be recognized as being his closest and most important ally. Luke chapter 9 and verse 54. Some of them show severity. Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down? There's some people that are giving us some trouble. They're quick to say, hey, how about we call on God to rain fire down and consume these people? Contentiousness among them. Luke 22 and verse 24. A dispute arose which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And so we're back to the same idea of wanting to be the greatest disciple. And now I'm arguing with my friends. No, Wesley, you're not. I'm the best. John, I don't know even why you think you deserve to be in the conversation, because clearly Wesley and I are head and shoulders above you. I can't imagine what this whole discourse was, but it says a dispute arose among them as to which one was regarded. They were arguing about who was more significant. Seems kind of petty to me, looking at it in hindsight, from a couple of thousand years removed, and it being about somebody else and not about me. Seems like they had a lot of advantages. It seems like they were already a special group and a special company. They were getting a pretty good deal because, as we talked about this morning, there was a group of wealthy women who were giving them a bunch of money to pay for their food and the things that they needed in life, where they could just go around with Jesus and listen to him preach. But that's not enough. I'm going to complain about whether or not I'm the most important among the group. And you got Peter, John 18 and verse 10. Simon Peter drew his sword and struck the high priest's ear. A little bit hasty, a little bit quick to violence. These are not trifling events. These are not small things. This isn't a one-off thing. These things come up over and over and over and over again. These are issues that are revealed in the course of their walking with Jesus. Exactly what's supposed to happen, by the way. That is exactly what is supposed to happen when we're exposed to the Word of God. When the standard of what is right is set before us, day after day after day, it exposes our weaknesses and our flaws and the things that we are doing that are contrary to what is right. That is exactly what happened with them. And then we have the fact that the weakness that they did have became action eventually when the pressure came. When push came to shove, when it was actually the time to stand up and be counted, Matthew 26:56 says all the disciples left him and fled. Peter, who had spoken so boldly, though they all fall away because you, I'll never fall away. Now, Greg may fail you, John, and Wesley may fail you, and Sean may fail you, and Jeff may fail you, but not me. I'm going to be right there by your side. That's what Peter said to Jesus. They may all fall away, but I'm not going to. He goes on to say in verse 35 of Matthew 26, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. Bold words. Verse 74. Verse 74 of that chapter. Same night. I do not know the man. This isn't uncertainty on the part of Peter. This is not confusion on the part of Peter. It's denial on the part of Peter. It is Peter intentionally trying to separate himself from Jesus, when he realizes that being close to Jesus puts him at risk, in danger. Even after the resurrection of Jesus, things are not settled in their life. The resurrection doesn't instantly resolve everything. Again, I think sometimes as we read the story, they go and the tomb is empty, and we go, certainly that must have really made a difference with them. Wow. And then he appears to them, and he speaks to them, and he eats with them. Thomas has a bunch of his friends, his close friends that he spent the last 3.5 years with, say, he's risen. We saw him with our eyes. We talked to him. And he says, unless I see, I will never believe. And the text tells us in Matthew 28:17, even after they saw Jesus, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Don't beat yourself up if there's a day that you wake up and you're wrestling with doubt, because here are the 12 disciples who spent three and a half years with Jesus, heard all of his teaching, both public and private, saw all of his miracles, and talked to him after his resurrection, and yet still doubted. It's sometimes a really painfully slow process to become mature in the faith. But things can change. Maturity can develop. Peter, who denied him 3 times, is later found speaking openly and boldly about Jesus. Acts chapter 2, verse 14 and following, and chapter 3, and chapter 4. Thomas, who refused to believe, came around eventually to confess, "My Lord and my God." Paul, the one chosen out of due season, the 13th apostle, who had threatened the people of God, who had spoke against them, who had persecuted them, according to Acts chapter 8 and verse 3, later is seen only as a former blasphemer. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 13. He's a former blasphemer. He changed, he matured, he grew up. He came to be a person of great faith, no longer speaking evil against Jesus. Things had changed within them and they grew up, all but the son of perdition. The son of perdition is the one that is lost. If you go back to that passage that we started in John 17, he says, I have kept them all except the son of perdition. You know what that word perdition means? It's an interesting word. It means the son of damnation. Their shortcomings did not disqualify them from belonging to God. They had those shortcomings when they were his. Did not disqualify them from being chosen by Christ. They had those shortcomings when Christ chose them. Now, they couldn't be ignored. The shortcomings couldn't just be ignored and said, oh, that's just the way he is, and not going to worry about that. They were exposed, they were shown as weaknesses. And then there was repentance, there was change, there was adjustment, there was growth, there was development. The question is not whether something is present in us that should not be there. The question is whether or not those things remain. Will it continue in us? Or will we change? Peter doesn't cleave to his failure. He doesn't even become despondent about his failure the way that Judas did. Judas was sorry about what he had done, just not enough to change. Peter was willing to get rid of that hastiness and that false boldness and that denial, self-saving attitude that he had. By the way, it wasn't perfect with him either, because quite some time later, as he engaged with some Gentile Christians and some Jewish friends showed up, he went, oh, wait a minute, can't have anything to do with those Gentiles anymore. And he had to yet be exposed again. Even after he had preached that fabulous sermon in Acts chapter 2 and done all that great work that he had done. There's still a problem there that had to be worked on and had to be developed. Thomas doesn't hold on to his doubt. Paul doesn't perpetuate his past persecution, but Judas went to his own place. And that presents for us the truth that we have choices. God has not called us to flawlessness. He's called us to faithfulness. These men were not flawless, but they belonged to God. They were faithful to God. And so they were not settled in their flaws, and they were willing to work on them. They viewed it as a choice. And that's what we're faced with. We're faced with choices. These men were all his, and because they were his, what was inconsistent with being his was made manifest. That is what happens. When you get into the light, it shows your flaws. The question isn't, do I have flaws? They're there. The question is, what am I going to do? Am I going to run away from the light so I don't see them? Or am I going to stay in the light so I can find them all and work on them? Choices. Jesus didn't expose what was inconsistent with them to cast them away. In this prayer in John 17, he is quite pleased as he says to the Father, I have lost none of them except one. Quite, but he didn't want to cast them away. If he wanted to cast them away, he wouldn't have chose them. Their inconsistencies were manifest because he wanted to bring them to repentance, because he wanted them to reach their potential, because he wanted them to see what they were able to do. And that same situation stands with each one of us today. We do not have to be flawless to be used by God. We do not have to be flawless to be with him. We don't even have to be flawless for him to say, they have kept my word. What we have to be is faithful, ready to acknowledge when we're wrong and ready to change what needs to be changed. And that is the picture of those 12 men. Not of supermen of faith who, because of their zealousness, were forever above mistakes, but common men just like each one of us, fighting and struggling with the same kind of bad attitudes and problems. The difference is they were insistent within themselves that they were going to do what was right when they were confronted with their flaws. And that's what we have to do. We have to be dedicated to the idea that we will be faithful to God no matter the cost. Peter was on to something when he said, even if I have to die, I will stand with you. He was on to something. Problem is, he just wasn't quite there maturity-wise yet. But he got there. And he did. He did, in fact, stand with Jesus, even if he had to die doing so. And that's our challenge. That's what we need to strive for. That's what it means to be a child of God. That's what it means to be a Christian. It's to be dedicated to the principle of growing in knowledge, of growing in faith, of growing in righteousness, and being faithful to that vision that God has for us. Maybe you're not there, or maybe you realize, something, my life lately has looked a whole lot more like Peter and Thomas's than it should. Well, change. That's what God calls you to do. And if we can help you tonight, if we can pray with you, if we can be of some encouragement to you, in strengthening you in some way, if you'll let it be known as we stand and sing, we'll do so.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout and